Hello and welcome to part 5 of our Chevy Apache build series. Today we're going to be getting rid of the old drum brakes and replacing them with a modern disc brake kit. So let's get started. When we first got this truck, the brakes were terrible. I had a scare when I backed off the trailer and found out they were nearly non-existent. Of course, we can't have this driving around town, so the solution is a disc brake kit. We've already fixed up the rear drums, so we're swapping out the fronts. You can go for just the front, all four, or keep the drums. Just make sure you get the right proportioning valve for your setup. With that decision made, we can start tearing the old brakes apart. Pull the wheels, the dust caps, then make sure you get the cotter pin before you take off the castle nut. If you're lucky, the drum should come off, although you may need to loosen off the pads with a little wheel in the back. With the drums off, we want to get to the backing plate connected to the spindle next. Some people say you can take off the 4 bolts holding it at this point, although personally I found it easier to pop off the springs holding the pads first. To get the wheel cylinder, I found it easiest to take off the bolt at the back, then just spin it off. With everything out of the way, it's easy to get the 4 bolts holding the backing plate to the spindle now. I also wanted to point out just how tired and beat up this old flex line is looking. If these lines were to leak, paired with the old braking system, we would quickly lose all 4 brakes. With the bracket removed, we're ready to start installing the new disc brakes. Alright, so for the rest of the video you're going to notice everything down here is a little bit cleaner. And this is because while we're in there, we decided to also do some suspension work, lower everything down, and also just clean everything up. More on that next video. Anyways, for now, back to it. First step of the kit is bolting on these caliper brackets. Make sure you have the correct one for each side. Put the 2 shortest bolts at the top, and then the very longest bolt through the bracket at the bottom. There seems to be a common issue where the passenger side bracket doesn't quite sit flush. To remedy this, I marked the area that was rubbing, and then we could ground it down to clear. It's important it fits right or everything will be out of alignment. Next, we can bolt the steering system back on. You might have to massage the driver's side a bit to get everything to fit in. With that in place, we can move on to the rotors. Unfortunately, this kit requires you to reuse the inner hub section of your old drum setup. Once again, we clean that up before pressing the new studs through. This can be a bit tricky. Ideally, you'll have a press of some sort. There's also a spacer, which in our case didn't sit flat on the new rotors, so you might have to drill it out a bit, just a heads up. With the spacers sorted, we can grease up our bearings and slide everything onto the new spindles. Once again, install the castle nut and a fresh cotter pin. You want to make sure they don't move, as they'll really beat up your spindles. Next are the calipers. These are a breeze to install. Just slide out the 2 pins, line up the caliper, and then slide and screw them back in. Later on, I'll probably go back and lubricate the pad ears and contacts like any other braking system. With all this done, we can throw in the wheels and start figuring out the brake lines. Again, this will vary depending on your setup. With our dual master and proportioning valve, we're going to run an individual line to the front left, front right, and one to the rear. This was my first time doing brake lines, and we didn't have the tool to make the double flare, so we decided to try buying some pre-made lines. This actually turned out to be a cheaper option, although we had to get used to it a bit and do some brainstorming. I used the old lines as a template before I bent the new ones, and overall I'm really happy with how the new ones look, although I might clean them up a bit in the future along with all the wiring in here. With the new lines all hooked up and tightened, we can start bleeding the system. It's important to bleed the master cylinder first. It's recommended to do this in the vise, but with 2 people we figured we could do it on the truck. We poured in the recommended DOT3 fluid and let it sit for about 15 to 30 minutes to let it seep in and lubricate the seals before we started pushing on the brake. Next, you have to hook up these 2 tubes provided with the master. Try to push slowly as to not aerate the fluid too much. I found pressing the brake all the way in, then letting it out extremely slowly so the bubbles could rise in the tube before pushing them back out sped up the process. Do this until there's no air or bubbles left. With the master bled, we took off the plastic tubes one at a time and attached the master to the proportioning valve. There are lots of videos on how to bleed brakes. Usually start the furthest wheel from the master, but in this case the order isn't really a huge deal as our master is split between the front and the back. While bleeding the lines, we found a few leaks, including one on this banjo bolt where the flex line meets the caliper. Apparently this is common with the kit, and you might need to play with the copper washers, although some people said they needed entirely new calipers due to a misplaced opening. Anyways, after bleeding, you should all be done. Throw the top back on the master and check your pedal feel. So that's all for today. Next video we're going to look at the front suspension and get this truck running and driving again after a long break. As always, if you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.